Food lines are getting longer from coast to coast. An extra 17 million people have been struggling to get food in 2020, according to Feeding America, the nation's largest hunger relief organization. A quarter of all children in the United States are facing hunger. Food banks and pantries were already dealing with a surge in demand before the rush of the holidays.
There are so many service workers, restaurant workers, hotel workers who have been laid off and need food.
Charles Meng is the CEO of the Arlington Food Assistance Center.
Half of our families are the working poor. And what we've seen is more of those working poor are coming to us, and they're coming more often. So the need has increased both in numbers and in terms of frequency.
Donations are barely satisfying America's huge hunger problem. Luis Gordia is the president of the think tank, the Food Research and Action Center.
The people who are hardest hit are communities of color, households with children, and people at the lowest end of the income scale. We are not all sharing this burden equally.
What do you worry about most when you see what's happening with food insecurity in this country?
That we don't learn our lesson. We had a problem in this country before COVID started, but it has really shown a light very brightly on a lot of these problems in terms of income inequality, structural racism, inadequate wages, unsteady employment. So my hope is that we can learn from this crisis.
Wanda Brookins is looking after her 11-day-old grandson because her daughter is in hospital with COVID. And this is for you as well?
Oh, thank you. That's a blessing.
Wanda still shares the little food she receives.
That day that one person walked by and didn't have nothing to eat, but you had a pocket full of money, you did not help that person. You're going to be held accountable for it, even if it was $1 that you gave.
Wanda Brookins ending that report by Larry Madowo in Virginia. Now let's get some sports news with Joe Parsons.
Thank you. Manchester United will be without Edinson Cavani for their New Year's Day match against Aston Villa as the Uruguay striker begins a 3-match ban for a social media post last month. The Uruguay international's also been fined £100,000. That's around $137,000. Cavani will also miss the League Cup semi-final against Manchester City and United's third-round tie in the FA Cup against Watford. With more, football reporter Simon Stone.
Cavani made the post after scoring the winner at Southampton on the 29th of November. The post contained a Spanish phrase that is offensive in some contexts. When the meaning of this was explained to him, he deleted the post and apologised. But under new FA regulations, the minimum punishment for such offences are 3 matches. The charges brought against him, he pleaded guilty out of a solidarity in the fight against racism. He has also apologised again for the post. He will be fined £100,000. He must also undergo training. Manchester United want the written reasons for the decision to include a reference to the fact that Cavani is not a racist and there was no racist intent behind his post. And they also want the fine to go to FA anti-racism projects.
Tributes have been paid to the former Manchester United, Chelsea and Scotland manager Tommy Docherty, who's died at the age of 92 after a long illness. As a player, Docherty earned 25 caps for Scotland, but he was best known for his 5 years in charge of United, who he guided to victory over Liverpool in the 1977 FA Cup final. The former Scotland winger, Pat Nevin, says Docherty was the perfect fit for United.
He always seemed to do it in an exciting way. Everyone you talk about the teams that he managed or coached, they wanted to do it in an exciting way. So he would have been in many ways the perfect man for Manchester United, and any club would like it anyway, because you want to win things, but you want to win them in style as well, and that's exactly the type of man he was.
In Spain, Real Sociedad beat Athletic Bilbao 1-0 in the Basque Derby. Sociedad remain in third place in La Liga with 29 points, 4 behind Real Madrid, who have a game in hand, and 6 behind the leaders Atletico Madrid. The two sides will meet again in the Spanish Super Cup in January and in last season's delayed Copa del Rey final in April.
Joe, thank you. That was Joe Parsons. A rescue team in Norway has managed to search one of the more stable parts of the crater opened up by a landslip to look for 10 people who are still missing. A dog and its handler were winched down by a helicopter but found no signs of life. Another 46 people have been evacuated from their houses in Gjerdrum, northeast of Oslo, as more cracks appeared in the ground. Ralph Løvstad from the Norwegian newspaper Dagbladet is close to the site of the disaster.
Last bulletin, they sadly haven't found anyone living or dead in the ruins, so they keep on searching during night. It's a difficult terrain and very dangerous because of the nature of the quick clay, which is in the liquid form, and also it's winter up here, so it's below freezing, and there's a great danger that the ruins and the debris will collapse even further. So it's a very demanding rescue mission, which they stress they still call it a rescue mission, not a recovery mission. They're still searching for survivors.
That was Ralph Løvstad. Now, Neil has some of the other stories we're following today.
Police in Ecuador say they've seized a record amount of drugs in the last year, 128 tons. The authorities have also reported a 12% increase in the number of murders. Ecuador shares borders with Colombia and Peru, the world's biggest producers of cocaine. The Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has said there's no delay in the country's vaccination program against Covid-19, and inoculation is likely to begin in February. His comments come as Brazil reported more than 1,000 deaths for a third consecutive day. Leonardo Racha reports.
Mr. Bolsonaro has reaffirmed that vaccination won't be compulsory and has said that he doesn't intend to take it. He believes he developed immunity after contracting the illness several months ago. There's been a surge in the number of coronavirus infections in the past month across Brazil. In several states, hospitals are operating at full capacity and cemeteries are running out of space to bury the victims of COVID. Rio de Janeiro's famous New Year's Eve celebrations have been cancelled, but restrictions are being largely ignored across the country.
And Adobe Flash Player, the browser plugin that brought rich animations and interactivity to the early web, has officially reached the end of its life. Released in 1996, Flash was once one of the most popular ways for people to stream videos and play games online, but it did not make the transition to the smartphone era.
Neil, thank you. Ubuntu is a philosophy which originated in South Africa but took on an international dimension after it was championed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the chairman of the country's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But what exactly is Ubuntu and how did it become global? Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding has this report.
It seemed like democratic South Africa's gift to the world, Ubuntu.
The time for the healing of the wounds has come.
A generation ago, as Nelson Mandela guided his nation away from civil war, one word seemed to sum up an almost miraculous spirit of reconciliation.
Ubuntu. Africa is the birthplace of Ubuntu. I am because we are.
It was Archbishop Desmond Tutu who led the preaching of Ubuntu through the 1990s, as he oversaw South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, urging people to confront the crimes of apartheid and, where possible, to forgive.
Ubuntu is an approach to life that is very difficult to describe in English words. It speaks to the very essence of being human, saying, my humanity is inextricably bound up in yours.
Soon enough, the word and its spirit, the spirit of the so-called Rainbow Nation, spread abroad.
Essential wisdom of Africa about the human condition is captured in the word Ubuntu.
Bill Clinton spoke of it.
There's a word in South Africa.
Barack Obama, too.
Ubuntu.
In Scotland, Ubuntu has been credited as an inspiration for the Poverty Truth Commission.
It's not just about the government. You can make a difference. Thank you.
But back here in South Africa, many today are wondering if Ubuntu has lost its power. lost its way.
I know it's been packaged in many ways, and unfortunately it's also been a kind of a corporate gimmick.
Sibongile Makabela, a veteran of the liberation struggle and a social justice activist, feels the word has been hijacked, turned into a brand.
When you package a value and a principle and you commercialize it, you lessen its value and its meaning.
Those implicated in irregular tender processes linked to the COVID relief.
Given the corruption here, it was perhaps inevitable that the pandemic would offer new opportunities for looting.
Allegations of corruption involving tenders of personal
90 companies and deals worth more than 2.2 billion.
But at the same time, COVID-19 has also been something of a rallying cry for Ubuntu.
The kids who see me sometimes say, oh, there's a pirate.
On a video call from Cape Town, Father Michael Lapsley is waving what he calls his hooks, the metal prostheses where his hands once were.
3 months after Nelson Mandela was released from prison, I received a letter bomb in the post inside 2 religious magazines, which blew off my hand and an eye, and my eardrums were shattered.
Since then, Father Michael says, his injuries have helped him to encourage others to open up about their own traumas, to help spread Ubuntu, needed now more than ever.
Andrew Harding. And a reminder of our main world news at the moment. Britain has officially left the European Union Single Market and Customs Union, with the British government warning that the new relationship may not at first run smoothly. I'm Jackie Leonard. You've been listening to the newsroom from the BBC in London.
This is the BBC World Service, and here's what World Book Club have been reading.
Reykjavik has undergone a transformation. An ominous hush lies over the busiest...
I'm Harriet Gilbert, and we've been reading a novel published 7 years ago, but uncannily prophetic. A story of love and cinema set during the 1918 flu pandemic. It was one of those rare moments in history where everything seems to happen at the same time. The book's called Moonstone, The Boy Who Never Was, by the Icelandic author Sjón. All of a sudden, this book mirrors the direct experience of people today.
Can you talk to us a little bit about how you prepared to write this book?
I thought it was a powerful and vibrant story.
Are you inspired by old movies?
What I've always tried to do in my writing is to acknowledge that reality exists on different levels for all of us.
World Book Club with Sjón, Sunday at 14 GMT.
Hello, I'm Manny Jasmy, and on this week's World Football, we're looking back at the Ibrox disaster of 1971. 66 Rangers fans were killed as they tried to leave Ibrox at the end of the Old Firm match between Rangers and Celtic. We'll hear from someone who was in the crush, and the Rangers captain that day who had to share the dressing room with some of the dead. And we'll discuss the aftermath with Pat Nevin and the BBC's Roddy Forsyth. Join us after the BBC News.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. The United Kingdom has cut its final ties with the European Union after 47 years of membership and 11 months of transition. An 11th-hour trade deal gave British businesses tariff and quota-free access to their largest market, but there's expected to be more bureaucracy. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the UK had freedom in its hands, but Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said Europe should keep the light on. Scotland would be back soon, she said. Muted New Year celebrations are continuing around the world, with major public events scaled down across Europe due to the pandemic. In the Scottish capital, Edinburgh, a single bagpiper welcomed in midnight, and police dispersed a small crowd that gathered in defiance of warnings. The Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has insisted there is no delay in the country's vaccination program, which is likely to begin in February. His comments come as Brazil reported more than 1,000 deaths for a third consecutive day. The World Health Organization has for the first time approved the emergency use of a coronavirus vaccine. It said the Pfizer-BioNTech jab had satisfied its safety and efficacy requirements. The WHO said it would now be able to channel information about the vaccine around the world. A Republican U.S. senator who's facing a runoff vote next week that could determine which party controls the Senate has been told to quarantine. David Perdue's campaign said he had been in close contact with someone infected with the coronavirus. North Korean delegates are arriving for the first Congress of the ruling party in 5 years. The North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is expected to outline a new strategy to combat the worst economic crisis in a generation. North Korea has suffered severe typhoons and floods. BBC News.
On the 2nd of January 1971, 66 people went to a football match and never returned home alive. 50 years on, in this special edition of World Football, we're looking back at the fateful 1-1 draw between Scottish rivals Rangers and Celtic through the eyes of the survivors.
The city of Glasgow is still recoiling in horror at one of the greatest disasters in its history. 66 football supporters attending the annual New Year match between two of Scotland's greatest clubs, Glasgow Rangers and Glasgow Celtic, were crushed or suffocated to death when a crush barrier at the end of one of the terraces collapsed. The final death toll, we're told, may in fact be even higher.
This has been very serious indeed. From where I'm sitting high up here in the press box, through the darkness and the fog, the ambulances are still there at that certain spot beneath the east terracing. And from where I'm sitting here, I can see what looks to me rather like bodies, I'm afraid, alongside the goalpost here at the east end of the park. It is indeed, and has been, a very, very serious accident indeed.
At the time, the Ibrox disaster was the worst that had happened in British football. As well as the 66 who died, at least 145 were injured in the crush to leave via one of the exits in the east end of Ibrox Park, Stairway 13. Hello, this is Manny Jasmy. Welcome to our first programme of 2021. I'm joined by the former Scottish international Pat Nevin, as always, and also the BBC Scottish football commentator Roddy Forsyth, who was at Ibrox on the day of the disaster as a fan. Welcome to the programme, Roddy. What do you remember of that day?
It was an unusual day in terms of the tranquility. This was an Old Firm day, New Year in Glasgow. People, of course, having enjoyed a good drink with their relatives, and some of them still in a condition that would indicate that. Yet this was, as I say, a tranquil day. It was, in weather terms, it was very still, it was misty, it was grey, there was little light in the day. And in football terms, there was nothing much to be achieved by this game. Whatever happened, Celtic were well in front in the league of Rangers. Rangers were really non-contestants at this stage of the proceedings. And indeed the only plausible contender for the title were Aberdeen, and the Rangers supporters marked this during the game by singing the song The Northern Lights of Old Aberdeen. The game, as you know, was still scoreless as it went into the final minute. Then Jimmy Johnson scored to put Celtic ahead, and Colin Stein equalised almost immediately for Rangers. When I left the game, I did not know that the disaster had occurred, although I had walked right past the scene of the incident. And when I was walking about half a mile from the ground, I heard the first sirens coming, and I thought, that is very strange, because I wouldn't have thought there was any trouble today. It never occurred to me there had been any other kind of accident. So it had been, as I say, a tranquil day, not necessarily a peaceable day if you lived around Ibrox on an Old Firm day, but calm by Old Firm standards.
Pat, what were Old Firm games like in those days? What was the rivalry like? Was it as bitter as it is today?
In many ways it was, but in some ways it kind of wasn't. I think the real sort of rioting that you would get between certain Rangers fans got quite bad during the sort of mid to late 70s, but there was certainly, the sectarian problem that was always there between Rangers and Celtic, the Catholic club and the Protestant club as they were understood to be. So there was an extreme rivalry between the two. Celtic certainly within the midst of a very, very long run of having the upper hand between the two clubs. When you were growing up in that area, I was very young, I was only 8 years old at the time, and Roddy will feel the same. There were probably 3 stadiums in your mind, and it was Hampden Park, it was Celtic Park, and it was Ibrox, and that's all there was. And they all had a number of things in common, and one of the things in common that, when I think back at them now, they were almost like hollowed out volcanoes. the steep stairs up, steep banking up and then back down into the kind of bowl of the volcano. But the steep stairs was always the problem. And they had them at Hampden Park, and they had them at Celtic Park, and they had them at Ibrox Park as well. And the odd thing is, Roddy, I'm sure you'll say this as well, we had all been scared at points. We had all been in crushes. We had all had moments where we thought, oh my goodness, I have lost control here. So it was, there was rivalry, but, we also understood there was some danger, not just with the rivalry, but possibly the stadiums too.
Well, my father, who was a regular attender at Ibrox and Firhill, had taught me not to use Stairway 13. The reason being it was the closest stairway to the underground station, we call it the subway in Glasgow. Copland Road as it was then, Ibrox as it is now. So that was the nearest transport hub, and it was very close to the ground, and people would run to get there before the queues began to form. I found danger in several respects. One was if you were actually on the subway platform when the crowd was pouring down into the station, you were liable to be pushed onto the track, so I very quickly stopped ever using that, and my father's advice used to walk away from the ground back along the subway route until I found a quiet station. He also taught me never to use Stairway 13, use Stairway 19 if you're ever going to leave the ground, and give it 10 or 15 minutes before you try to leave the ground so that the main crushes disappear. And on the day of the disaster, I walked right past the top of Stairway 13 on my way to Stairway 19. And in those days, they had, because of previous accidents on the stairway, they had built concrete baffles along the top of the stairway, so that unless you actually went down Stairway 13, you couldn't see what was happening there. So I walked right past it after the disaster had happened, while people were still being crushed. And I vividly remember a policeman standing at the top with his radio on, his walkie-talkie on his tunic pocket, and he didn't know it had happened either. And that's the most extraordinary feature of my memory, that I was so close to it and didn't realise.
Manny, one thing just to add on top of it, people do talk about the sectarianism, which is and was a great problem between those two clubs. It had nothing to do with that disaster.
Well, we'll speak in great detail about the disaster itself in a few minutes, but first, let's go back a decade earlier to September 1961, an event which was a tragic warning of what was to come. It was another Old Firm match, another stoppage time equaliser by Rangers, and another euphoric and lethal crush in which two fans were killed. John Hodgman went to both games and remarkably on both occasions was trapped on Stairway 13. In 1961 he was a 14-year-old Rangers fan. These are his memories of what were nearly his final moments.
In these days the crowds were used to swaying and there was a bit of crushing all the time and nobody bothered really, everybody. And this day was celebrating, singing and chanting on their way out of the ground. We rolled over the top of the steep exit stairway. We were like a sort of human tsunami. And I tried to get my arms free, but I was jammed. Stairway 13 was more dangerous than other exits. It was very steep. Steps had been worn away by millions of feet. More so at that end, because the Rangers end was always packed. Anyway, being a young boy, my feet weren't even touching the ground. And that was exciting too, until we stopped moving. We swayed forward again. I was terrified. I remember I screamed at those around me, but they were all oblivious or bawling out all these sectarian songs. I had been as well. The crowd stopped completely, and it was like a slow, hard punch in the solar plexus, gasping for breath. But it wasn't like being underwater. I'd always imagined, gasping for breath was like trying to breathe out. But it's the opposite. You'd lost all the air and you were gasping to breathe in. My ear popped and tasted blood. I thought my chest was splintering, I remember. I thought I was dying. Anyway, I was taken to hospital. I was kept in overnight, but nothing was broken. 2 men had died, so everyone said I was lucky. And the doctor said I was a good wee Rangers man. I still went to Ibrox for a while, but I no longer looked at Rangers with the same reverence. I noticed the conditions now. We were subjected to filthy toilets and lack of seats, and there was nothing done to make that stairway any safer, and I never wanted to go near it again.
John Hodgman recalling with quite unsettling clarity what had happened to him 60 years ago. Roddy, you and Pat have both said that you were aware that there were risks when you went to these big games. There were further crashes in the 60s on Stairway 13 in 1967 and 69, and when the family of someone who died in the 1971 disaster successfully sued Rangers, the presiding sheriff in the case said this: "So far as the evidence is concerned, the board," meaning the Rangers board, "never so much as considered that it ought to apply its mind to the question of safety on the particular stairway, and would appear, I put it no higher, to have proceeded on the view that if the problem was ignored long enough, it would eventually go away." What did Rangers do, if anything, during the 60s as these crushes and, fairly regular warning signs came and went?
I met that Sheriff Irvin Smith some years ago and discussed this with him. I felt he'd been partly correct about this, that Rangers had essentially waited it out to some degree, and that they had to be given a certain degree of understanding there, because the problem was so great. They were in what was considered to be the best club ground in the United Kingdom, believe it or not. It was well appointed by the standards of the day, and they had in fact taken some measures after the earlier accidents. I mentioned the concrete baffles at the top of the terracing in front of the stairway. That was to stop people coming straight over the top of the terracings and straight down as they had done, and I had experienced some of that. It was frightening. The earlier leavers would sometimes simply, and this sounds extraordinary and unbelievable, they would sprint down these stairways 3 or 4 steps at a time, and if you happened to be in their way when they came down, you would be knocked to the side deliberately.
Pat, were you allowed to go to Old Firm games? Because, as you say, you were 7 or 8 years old at that time in 1971.
Yes, I'd been to the cup final the year before.
So what was it like for a small boy to go into that?
We'd been brought up with it, we'd never gone to Ibrox. I think the first time I ever went to Ibrox I played. It was that long. But that wasn't a done thing, mostly with the Rangers fans at Ibrox. But I'd been to Celtic and Rangers games at Celtic Park, and I'd been at Hampden Park as well. And yes, there was a tension. And yes, I wouldn't be allowed to go on my own, clearly. My dad would be there, other members of the family would be there as well. But yes, it's what you loved, what you grew up with, what was surrounded. I mean, we heard earlier on in the John Hodgson interview, it was normal. There was a normality to this, what in hindsight looks mad. It really does. But I can remember so many times, and it is so many times, and it wasn't just at those grounds, it was at other grounds as well, where crushes were so common. So I would be going to these games, but my dad, a very strong man, had been a boxer. He would, get his body around, his children to make sure they were okay and safe. But we knew, and he knew, that there but for the grace of God goes. And this, we are talking about Ibrox Stadium here, and of course they'd had the warnings and then they had the disaster. But in 1970, and I'm sure it may well have been a game that Roddy was at as well, but I was at the Celtic vs Leeds United game at Hampden Park.
I was, yes.
And there, but for the grace of God, went exactly the same thing.
Exactly. And this was in the European Cup when there were 136,000 in the stadium.
Exactly. And by sheer luck, nothing more than sheer luck, I can say, from being there and trying to get out and trying to survive well in at the game itself. I mean, by the way, they say 135,000. Well, there's more than that, because I got lifted over. Many others did too.
So did I. And Pat, I don't know where you were standing in that game, but I was down in the bottom of what they call the Celtic end.
Me too.
At that point, and it was frightening, because even near the front, again, another tip my father had said is, if you're going to stand on terraces and they're going to be crowded, stand near the front so you can get onto the pitch if something happens. And there were sways at that game that pressed me against the front wall, and I left a little bit earlier than I would have done normally, about 10 minutes before the end, just because it was frightening.
You're listening to World Football on BBC World Service. I'm Manny Jasmine. Pat Nevin, as always, is here, and we're joined this week by the BBC's football commentator Roddy Forsyth, because we're looking back on the Ibrox disaster that took place 50 years ago on Saturday. And The match itself, the Old Firm game between Rangers and Celtic, really burst into life in the final minutes when Jimmy Johnston, with a rare header, gave Celtic the lead, which was cancelled out almost immediately by Colin Steen. And then, on Stairway 13, a fatal crush developed as fans tried to leave for home. Among the 66 who died was 8-year-old Nigel Pickup from Liverpool in Glasgow with his family for New Year. This was his first match. 5 boys aged between 13 and 15 from the same village also died. John Hodgman, who nearly died in a crush in 1961 and then drifted away from his support of Rangers, was also at Ibrox, only this time as a journalist.
The noise was, it was verging on the hysterical, but I can't say cold or calm, but I knew better this time. When we were being swept slowly along the dirt track towards the top of Stairway 13, I just got my arms free and onto the backs of those in front. There's no way I was going back down into that death trap. There was a big strong fence along the side on the left before the stairway, and a few metres before the top of it, I managed to get my fingers into 2 of the struts, and it was thick. I just held on there for grim death, as they say. The crowd slowed to a stop, but the wild celebrations didn't. They were still going on. I could see those on the stairway were piling up and coming up against those who'd fallen a couple of flights down, and this pyramid of bodies building up against them, and the police on duty at the bottom of the stairs, and they came running up and kind of dived into the tangled mess. It was really it was just frightening, the whole thing, and they were linking arms to try and stop more people coming over. The people were all in a tangled mess. They were very brave. They could have been killed themselves. A St John's ambulanceman saw me sitting. I was probably traumatised sitting on the top of the stairway, and he just said, he grabbed my arm, he said, "Are you hurt, lad?" And I shook my head, and he said, "Well, go then, get down there and try and help." And that's what I did.
Did it feel like the past had become your present in that moment, or were you just focused on survival?
I know my legs were shaking so much that I couldn't stand up. I had to sit down. I know objectively almost now that I'd forgotten I was a journalist. I was just completely shocked by what had happened. And my heart was racing and my legs were shaking, and I couldn't do anything to help until this ambulance men prodded me into doing that.
I know that once you got out of Ibrox, you went straight to your newspaper office and wrote down everything that had happened to you. But before that, as you say, you were prodded into action by an ambulance man to help the injured. What did you do, John, to help them?
Not much. I still have the clipping from that newspaper. I know we're on radio, but I can assure you it's yellow, and it's here, and it says, it's headlined, "Oh no, not again," I said, by John Hodgman, and that part of it, I'll read a wee bit of it. It says, "I did what I could. I pounded the chests of those who showed small stirrings of life in an effort to get their hearts beating. I pulled youngsters from the jumbled pile of bodies. We laid the dead aside and covered their faces. It was a frantic fight to save the living. Twice I leaned over a body and applied the kiss of life. Twice I failed. I saw 2 policemen carry a small covered bundle to the top of the stairs, and one of them wept openly as he repeated over and over, 'It's only a wee boy.' I didn't remember writing that.
Half a century has passed since that disaster, but your memories are so vivid. How does it make you feel with the buffer of those decades between the disaster and you when you talk about it now?
Even today, doing this, it's still difficult. Even now, it's still difficult thinking of the people there, and you're bending over people who are staring sightless at the sky, and you can't help them. It's not easy. I mean, I have been fortunate enough that I haven't had to fight in a war or be in any other really terrible, life-threatening situation. But my hearing's, damaged. And sometimes I wonder if the psychologists and so on are right, you know, that you do relive your experiences even subconsciously. I'm not sure.
John Hodgman, Roddy Forsyth, listening to that account from John, you would have been, you know, just metres away from him during the match, and you walked past Stairway 13, he went down it. But are there echoes of what you remember in what he was saying?
One of the things that strikes me very forcibly, and whenever I think of the day and when I recollect my own movements, I was going to a youth club on the other side of the river to play snooker with my mates, and I had walked back 3 or 4 subway stations till things were quiet. I think I'd said to you I'd heard the sirens and thought, that's strange, it was a quiet game, don't expect there to be fighting. Got to the youth club, was playing snooker, having a laugh with my mates, when somebody brought a late edition of the Evening Times Glasgow Sports paper into the club, and it said there had been 6 dead in an accident at Ibrox. Well, that was bad, but it was the sort of thing that had happened before. As the evening moved on, people would come and go, and then someone brought in, I think, an early edition of the Sunday Express, which was the paper John Hodgman worked for, and it said 66 dead. At this point, and it was the first time in the evening it occurred to me, I should get in touch with my parents and tell them I'm okay. But we didn't have a telephone, and so I had to phone neighbours and get them to go to the house, where I discovered from the first thing my father said was, "Why have you not been in touch? You should have told us you were okay." And of course he was frantic with worry, as was my mother. And so it took a good considerable amount of time for me, and I'd been at the game, to understand what had happened, and then realise I had really better tell my parents that I was all right. But in the day that we live in now, where people tweet and email and post online immediately, we would have known within minutes what had happened, and yet it took me until something like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock that evening to grasp that something enormous and cataclysmic had happened, that I had walked past it, been within feet and yards of it, and had no idea what was happening.
John Gregg was the Rangers captain that day. He's been voted as the club's greatest ever player by fans. He, like Roddy Forsyth and the thousands of other fans who were just metres away from the unfolding disaster, was oblivious to it as it was happening. But he came face to face with the tragedy soon enough.
For some unknown reason, I had been getting treatment for a knock I'd received in the game, and when I came back into the dressing room, nearly all the players had left, and I was starting to put my clothes on, and people started bringing in a couple of bodies and put them on the massage tables. And I thought, well, what on earth happened? And the guy says, well, there's been a terrible accident. You need to try and move out of here as quick as you can. So I got ready as quickly as I could, and I wandered along the corridor to go out to the pitch and down the tunnel. And I always remember it was a real damp, gloomy, misty winter's day, and the place just looked as if a bomb had hit it was like people were running everywhere. There was sirens going. They'd laid down some bodies and covered them, and it was then that I realised just the impact of what had happened. It was like, probably in many ways, looking at a movie that you didn't really want to see. I felt bad enough about it, but I kept thinking what it must have been like for the relatives of the people who had been killed in the accident, because I don't think anybody can ever know how they must have felt when one of their loved ones left their house in the morning to go to a football match and never came back again. Even now, when I talk like this, I find it hard to understand, hard to believe. And I was only playing in the game, and these people had to live with it. The one thing that's come out of this, not just for Rangers supporters who I live with and I admire, but for all football supporters in the United Kingdom, this stadium was used as a template to make sure that any rebuilding of stadiums in Britain had to be to a certain level. And if, in doing that, it saves any terrible accidents like happened here in the future, then that will at least be something that's come out of it.
That's the former Rangers captain John Gregg speaking about the Ibrox disaster 10 years ago. Pat, initially the theory was that the crush happened because the fans who had left early had heard the roar and came back and collided with the fans who were leaving at the end of the game. But that's not the accepted version of events now.
No, it seemed to make perfect sense, didn't it? The late goal was scored, everyone rushed to get out. Another goal, equaliser scored, you rush back up and you have a problem that starts there. Then eventually the suggestion that, the buckling of one of the safety barriers and also people just falling. It's looking for blame in those situations. You go back to the fact that anyone who'd been in them knew any small thing could have caused it. Any of those things could have caused it. And was it important which one was? It was the fact that people had died and there was not a safe way, to get in and out of the stadiums, but particularly get out of the stadiums at a time. So, that's, the version of events. I mean, who knows how true all of it is. But in the fog of what was happening, and it was a foggy night, but the fog of the madness that was going on, who can know fully, absolutely what happened? But the one fact is I wouldn't be blaming supporters for it, and I don't think anyone did at the time.
Does Stairway 13 still exist in one form or another, Roddy?
No, the stadium is all seated now, and the high banked terracings have long gone, so there's essentially a box stand, a cantilever stand there. There is a memorial close by, but the stairway went a long, long time ago and was never mourned. And there's not, I can tell you this, and I'm not exaggerating, there is not a single game I go to at Ibrox where I don't take a look over at where Stairway 13 was and remember it.
Speaking about the Ibrox disaster of 1971, the Rangers captain on that day, John Gregg, said, "That will remain the saddest day not only in our lifespan, but forever in the history of the club." My thanks to Pat Nevin, as always, and Roddy Forsyth for joining and telling us his memories. Pat and I will return next week. Join us then. In the meantime, from all of us, a very happy new year to you and a fervent wish that we will all have a better 12 months to come. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, looking at climate change.
The climate study endorsed by 11